As Charlie Cox moved deeper into his career, the weight of expectation began to change shape, shifting from the struggle to be seen into the challenge of being understood, because once attention arrives, it rarely comes with patience, and the world often wants simple versions of complex people. Charlie faced this transition with the same quiet discipline that had guided him through obscurity, refusing to simplify himself or his choices just to meet external demand. Instead of leaning into comfort, he leaned into responsibility, understanding that visibility amplifies not just success but mistakes, and that every role now carried consequences beyond performance. This awareness did not intimidate him, it sharpened him, encouraging deeper preparation, greater emotional precision, and an even stronger commitment to truth within his work. The characters Charlie Cox chose during this phase reflected his internal values, often burdened with moral ambiguity, inner conflict, and emotional weight, because he was drawn not to perfection, but to humanity in its rawest form. He understood that audiences connect most deeply not with invincible heroes, but with those who struggle quietly, who carry guilt, doubt, and responsibility without applause. His performances began to reflect a layered understanding of pain, restraint, and endurance, offering portrayals that felt less like entertainment and more like lived experience. This emotional authenticity distinguished him in an industry increasingly driven by spectacle, reminding viewers that subtlety can be more powerful than excess. Behind the scenes, Charlie Cox continued to approach his craft with humility, openly acknowledging the collaborative nature of storytelling and resisting the isolation that often accompanies success. He remained attentive to directors, responsive to fellow actors, and respectful of every role in the creative process. What made this stage of his journey especially compelling was Charlie Cox's ability to maintain emotional accessibility while carrying immense narrative weight, because even as his characters grew darker, more burdened, and more complex, his performances never lost warmth or humanity. He understood that strength without compassion becomes hollow, and his portrayals reflected this belief, grounding even the most intense moments in emotional truth. Audiences responded not just to the action or drama, but to the internal struggles unfolding beneath the surface, forming a deeper bond that extended beyond entertainment into empathy. As industry dynamics continued to shift, Charlie Cox demonstrated adaptability without compromise, navigating changing platforms, formats, and audience expectations while remaining rooted in the same principles that guided his early years. He didn't chase trends. He evaluated them, choosing projects that aligned with his long-term vision rather than short-term relevance. This patience protected his craft from dilution, allowing his work to mature rather than fragment, and ensuring that each new role added dimension rather than repetition to his career. His trajectory became an example of how to evolve thoughtfully in a rapidly changing landscape. Public recognition grew steadily, but Charlie Cox never allowed it to harden his outlook, maintaining an openness that reflected gratitude rather than entitlement. He spoke candidly about the unpredictability of acting, the fragility of opportunity, and the importance of remaining grounded regardless of success, offering a perspective shaped by years of uncertainty rather than sudden fortune. This honesty resonated with audiences who sensed that his humility was not performative, but earned, the result of navigating both invisibility and attention with equal care. At this point in his journey, Charlie Cox had become more than a talented actor, he had become a symbol of quiet perseverance. As time passed, Charlie Cox's career entered a phase where endurance mattered more than momentum, because sustaining relevance is far more difficult than achieving it, and this stage tested not just his talent but his values, patience, and sense of self. The industry around him continued to accelerate, chasing instant reactions, viral moments, and constant reinvention, yet Charlie remained grounded in a slower rhythm, trusting that meaningful work requires space to breathe and time to mature. He understood that longevity is built through alignment rather than urgency, and this awareness allowed him to step back when necessary, reassess direction, and move forward with clarity rather than fear. Instead of viewing pauses as setbacks, he treated them as periods of recalibration, strengthening his creative instincts and emotional resilience. The depth Charlie Cox brought to his performances during this stage reflected an expanded understanding of vulnerability, because he had learned that emotional strength is not about suppression, but about controlled release, about allowing audiences to witness internal conflict without spectacle. His characters carried silence as heavily as dialogue, using restraint to communicate pain, doubt, and resolve, and this approach resonated powerfully with viewers who recognized the honesty beneath the performance. He wasn't offering easy answers or simplified morality, he was presenting complexity with compassion, inviting audiences to engage with uncertainty rather than escape it. This willingness to dwell in ambiguity elevated his work beyond entertainment into reflection. As expectations grew heavier, Charlie Cox faced the challenge of legacy, the question of how to honor what has come before while continuing to evolve creatively. He navigated this tension by embracing growth without erasure, respecting the roles that defined him while actively seeking opportunities that expanded his range. Behind the scenes, Charlie Cox continued to deepen his understanding of storytelling, engaging with projects not just as an actor, but as a thoughtful participant in a larger creative vision. He valued preparation, dialogue, and collaboration, recognizing that the strongest performances emerge from collective effort rather than individual dominance. This mindset strengthened his leadership within productions, allowing him to support others while maintaining his own creative integrity. His professionalism became a quiet benchmark, influencing environments through example rather than instruction. As the cultural conversation around storytelling shifted, with audiences increasingly drawn to authenticity and emotional truth, Charlie Cox's approach felt increasingly relevant, because he had been practicing those principles long before they became fashionable. His work reflected a belief that stories matter not because they distract, but because they connect, challenge, and humanize, and this belief guided his choices even when commercial outcomes were uncertain. He understood that art loses power when stripped of risk, and he remained willing to step into discomfort to preserve meaning. This stage of Charlie Cox's journey highlighted a rare balance between self-assurance and humility, because he had learned to trust his instincts without closing himself off to growth. He acknowledged limits without surrendering ambition, and this equilibrium allowed him to navigate criticism without defensiveness and praise without dependency. His sense of identity remained anchored not in outcomes, but in process, ensuring that external fluctuations never fully destabilized his internal compass. As his body of work continued to expand, Charlie Cox's influence extended quietly, shaping perceptions of what sustainable success in acting could look like. He demonstrated that depth compounds over time, that consistency builds trust. With each passing year, Charlie Cox's journey began to reflect a deeper understanding of balance, not just between work and rest, but between ambition and acceptance, because he had reached a stage where chasing success was no longer the goal, sustaining meaning was. He recognized that the industry's constant demand for reinvention could quietly erode identity if not navigated carefully, and so he chose steadiness over spectacle, trusting that staying grounded would protect both his craft and his sense of self. This period of his career was marked by intentional choices, where every role was evaluated not only for opportunity, but for alignment, emotional truth, and long-term resonance, and this selectivity strengthened the clarity of his artistic voice. Charlie Cox's performances during this time carried a maturity that could only come from lived experience, because he no longer needed to prove intensity, he embodied it naturally. His characters felt weighted with memory, responsibility, and quiet resolve, reflecting an actor who understood that the most powerful moments often arrive without announcement. He allowed scenes to unfold rather than force them, trusting silence, stillness, and subtle expression to convey depth, and this restraint invited audiences to lean in rather than sit back. The emotional gravity he brought to his work was not overwhelming, but absorbing, creating space for reflection rather than spectacle. As recognition continued, Charlie Cox became increasingly aware of the influence his consistency had on others, particularly younger actors navigating the same uncertainty he once faced. Without positioning himself as a mentor publicly, he led through example, demonstrating that respect, preparation, and humility are not outdated virtues, but enduring ones. His career quietly challenged the notion that success must come at the cost of kindness, showing instead that professionalism and empathy can coexist. At the same time, Charlie Cox maintained a healthy distance from the performative aspects of fame, understanding that visibility can distort priorities if allowed to dominate attention. He engaged with audiences authentically, without overexposure, and preserved a sense of privacy that protected his inner life from becoming public property. This boundary allowed him to return to his work with clarity and focus, ensuring that performance remained an act of exploration rather than exhibition. By refusing to let public perception dictate personal direction, he retained control over his narrative without needing to assert it loudly. The evolution of his career during this phase reflected a broader understanding of sustainability, because Charlie Cox had learned that creative endurance requires care, reflection, and the courage to slow down when necessary. He recognized that burnout often disguises itself as productivity, and so he prioritized intention over volume, choosing depth over accumulation. This approach not only preserved his passion for acting, but enhanced it, allowing curiosity to replace pressure as the primary motivator. His work continued to grow richer as a result, shaped by genuine engagement rather than obligation. As storytelling itself evolved across platforms and audiences, Charlie Cox adapted with intelligence rather than urgency, embracing change without abandoning core principles. He remained open to experimentation, yet discerning, understanding that relevance is not maintained through constant visibility, but through consistent quality. His choices reflected trust in the audience's ability to recognize sincerity over time, and this trust was rewarded with loyalty that transcended individual roles. Viewers followed his work not because it was ubiquitous, but because it was reliable in its honesty. What stood out most during this stage was Charlie Cox's calm confidence, a confidence not rooted in certainty of outcome, but in faith in process.